unable to. So my name is Portia Polk, and I am so excited to see you all. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Post-Secondary Education at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. The NGA Center for Best Practices provides our nation's governors with advice and counsel across the full range of policy issues facing states today to help them develop innovative solutions to their challenges. While the policy areas we support are diverse and the solutions equally so, we often see a common theme that runs through much of what we do, and that is the role that data can play to improve policymaking and decision-making. That's why we've decided to partner with the Beeck Center at Georgetown University on Data Labs, which is a no-cost training and technical assistance program that helps states launch data sharing projects to improve government services. Through this project, we hope to help states advance their use of data and evidence to inform their decision-making and help them share what they've learned with other states as well. The Data Labs program was developed in response to the challenges we heard from state data leaders. In the spirit of service, Data Labs organized this panel with a few of our key advisors to discuss some of the common challenges facing data leaders today and opportunities to improve the way we collect, manage, and share data to improve our policy and decision-making. As many of you know, sharing data across agencies comes with many challenges, both technical and non-technical. Our goal with this event is to leverage the collective wisdom of our three panelists so that you leave this discussion with new information or the spark for an idea to improve delivery of public services through data management. If you are interested in participating in more discussions like this and receiving hands-on support with your statewide data sharing project, I'm excited to share that we are now accepting project proposals for the upcoming Data Labs cohort of states. We encourage you to take a look at the Data Labs website and attend the upcoming information session this Friday, February 3rd at 12 p.m. Eastern. We'll follow up after this event with all the details. So now I want to get into a bit of housekeeping that'll guide the rest of our conversation today. We'll spend the next 40 minutes having a moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll switch to Q&A for roughly 10 minutes. During the moderated discussion, please put any questions you have for our panelists in the chat. We will monitor them as well as the Data Labs team. They'll select questions to ask our panelists. It's possible we won't get to everyone's question, which is unfortunate. We'll try our best. But if we don't get to your question and you're really eager for an answer, contact the Data Labs team after the event. We'll drop their email in the chat so you'll have it for reference, and they'll make sure that you can get your answer offline. And with that, I will pass it over to our moderator, Katya, to kick off our panel discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Katya Abazagian, and I am the Director of Programs at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. I am really excited to be speaking with the folks that we have here today. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly. We have Dessa Gipalo, the Chief Data Officer of the state of Illinois, Catherine Helms, the Chief Data Officer of the state of Oregon, and Robert McGaugh, the Chief Analytics Officer of the state of Arkansas. And I'm very proud to say that I have worked with these folks in multiple capacities, and I'm really excited to get to share some of their wisdom and knowledge with everyone today. I'll just say first that our hope with this conversation and leaving it as an open-ended space for discussion and hear some of the insights from these state data leaders is that we can unearth some of the less talked about elements of data management for service delivery that many of you who are public servants out there will likely be really familiar with, but that don't often get the spotlight. So our goal in crafting these discussion questions and bringing these particular folks to the stage was to get into the nitty-gritty and kind of show you a little bit of what the Data Labs program is all about and how deeply we like to go with the states that we're working with. So I'm just going to kick us off with a little bit of framing on our first topic, which is the role of organizational culture in successful service delivery through the use of data. So as many of you all know, technology and new tech tools and procurements for new tools are often what generates excitement for redesigning services and making them better. But as data leaders in your states, many folks out there are kind of sometimes sitting on the sidelines and waiting to be tapped in and waiting for the really rich data that states collect to be actually used in designing social services. And part of making that data useful is not just building the next dashboard or the next analytics platform, but it's also about training folks and building the capacity across the state, across agencies for people to use data to actually rethink and redesign how social services are delivered. So with that, I'm going to present our first question to our panelists here. Thinking about the role of data in your states, most of the people who you're trying to support in delivering services on the ground might not know exactly what they need from the data that you have or the technology that you have. What advice do you have for public servants out there who are trying to bring people across their governments into data decision making and data use in a way that will actually help them do their jobs and help them deliver services better? And I'm going to kick it to Catherine first.
Yeah, sure. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about some of the experiences and observations that we've seen in Oregon. Overall, when it comes to educating what I would call maybe our end users or folks that are responsible for data production within systems, I think specifically not identifying it as just a data problem, right? But it might be more of a procedural problem or a process problem. So it's about building that culture of continuous improvement and process awareness to really get end users aware of the data that I touch then has downstream impacts for future uses. I think overall, we found really good observations just by spending time sitting with our end users and hearing about operational hiccups that they're experiencing. So I'm a case manager, but I find that I don't necessarily always have access to the data or information about the specific client that I'm working with. Or I might be working in a workforce development panel, but I don't have enough intel about the other services that my users are receiving. And that's a really great way to start identifying some of those core challenges and thinking about it less as just a data problem and more as an ongoing kind of culture or process improvement challenge. And I think part of that then leads us to deeper conversations about user experience and even process efficiency within our organizations.
Great, thank you. Dessa, it looks like you want to respond to that.
No, I think that Catherine's answer is great. And I'm going to pull it back a little bit just from the state of Illinois and where we are with, kind of changing that culture, that data culture, building it up. So I had started just a little way back machine. I was the first ever chief data officer for Cook County, Illinois. And then I recently moved over to the state in 2021. And the biggest thing that I've seen is around being a data evangelist, right? There are a lot of folks who know the value of data. They need data, they want the analytical products from it, but they don't quite have the understanding of how to get from point A to analytics. And so my approach has typically been just being curious, right? It's not just your databases that need to be relational, it's also the conversations you have with your end users. So I really focus on that relationship building from the start, being curious, going to people and saying, hey, what are you working on? What's your program? What's your program's mission? What challenges do you have? What are some of the areas where you're running into problems? And how can I support you? And really starting more from that conversational aspect before we get into what Catherine is going into in the process, that oftentimes it's not just a data problem of accessibility or access. It comes a little bit further back of, we have this process problem and we're trying to figure out how to refine it, but that literacy, that awareness may or may not be there depending on who your audience is. Another thing that I've done that has been really successful and that I think about quite a bit is utilizing design thinking strategies. So who is your end user? Right? In government, we often think about data and technology as being a service provider, which we are. But our services that we're providing are often to agencies, departments, programs, not necessarily the person who is receiving the services or signing up online or getting something in person. And so that ability to kind of think in two different ways, that you're a service provider, not just for an agency or a program, but also for that end user, and centering that human's experience in the work that we do, tends to take it out of technology and data speak, which can be intimidating, and brings it more down to that human-centered level of, we're all working together to solve this gnarly challenge.
Yeah, and Robert, I'll let you tap in here.
Yeah, and just building on that and agreeing, that's kind of what we've found. Influenced by design thinking, user-centered design, working with our partners to understand in their own words what are the key business questions, and getting them to just really phrase it as who needs what information and what would they do with it. And so as we go through the process, we keep the focus on their core business need, so that they're getting what they need to serve citizens. And we work through it with them to give them some awareness in solving their problem with data sourcing, sharing, integration, and secure compliant delivery in that format that's optimized for that particular consumer end use. So that more kind of naturally introduces them to this repeatable set of data tools, strategies, and partners. And so over time, they learn more how to pull from state data systems and partners the capacity they need, and slowly gain in their analytic maturity journey and their own analytic capacity. But as a secondary benefit of focusing on their business need in a timely, effective manner, first and foremost.
That's great. And all of you sort of touched on this, but a lot of what people expect out of data is that business process information, the analytics that come from that, and answering kind of analytics questions with data. But as we know, sometimes when those analytics get reported up, there can be a culture of monitoring or a fear of monitoring that emerges from that process. And, you think of performance dashboards and things like that as a reference point that people have for how data gets used to improve things. How do you kind of balance the need to track outcomes through the data with making people feel comfortable with reporting on how they're doing, and kind of growing out of that culture of monitoring or judging performance? And I'll start with you, Dessa.
I love this question. So this is something I think about a lot with data. And, my approach at the state has been, let's not use data in a punitive manner, right? The data is the data. The data tells you something. It is informational, but it is not telling you the whole story. And before people go, hang on, wait, data solves everything. It doesn't. Context, right? Context is key. Context is important. And so when I'm thinking about this, measurement factor, performance, outcomes, KPIs, everything that we put into dashboards and that we're evaluating, there's two things that I kind of think of. One is that we are not data driven. We're data informed. Data is not driving the outcome. Data is informing the outcome. At the end of the day, there is still a human that has to make the decision of what to do with the information presented. We don't just blindly follow the information that's presented with us, because I think, as we'll get into in a little bit, talking about some of those pitfalls of data management, what happens when you have gaps in your data, what happens when your data is biased, right? And so just taking that in that we are data informed and we are not using data to punish. Going beyond that is we don't often have the right data when we're looking at outcomes. So when you think about how you measure something, there's widgets, right? Number of how many things that we have, and that may tell a story and that may be important. But then there's that longer tail of what is the outcome? So what happens if we move these levers, right? This gets more into data science. What happens if we move these levers and then we measure something over a longer period of time? You may not be using the same data points or the same data set to look at those two very different measurements. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. And so something that I always think about when we're getting to that outcome stage is, what are you measuring? Why are you measuring it? How does it fit into your overall mission and vision of the program that you're evaluating? And how do you know that this is the right data that's going to tell the story? Now, those are big, meaty questions. And that's where kind of this goes into this literacy and data awareness piece from the first question, is having that conversation in plain language without getting too deep into the weeds and too much into data speak, but really working with the programs to say, okay, this is how we know we're going to measure this piece. This is how we know we're going to measure this piece, and make sure that data is brought in up front. So when we do get into that, oh, we need to look at something over a period of time and not just a point in time, or we need to be able to do a look back report or a longitudinal study, having that basis of what that means and how that data is developed is going to go a lot farther than coming into a program and saying, oh, you don't have the right data, you need to go back and collect more. Because that's not helpful. That's not solving the problem. That's not furthering the culture that we're really trying to get at.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, this topic's near and dear to my heart. I come from an operations research background, but the biggest mistakes I see made, private, public, or otherwise, are measuring what is easy instead of what is needed, and measuring what is going well instead of focusing on the areas most in need of improvement. And so you had mentioned performance management. We don't need to rehash that here. Kaplan Norton from Harvard Business Review wrote 4 huge influential volumes on that over the past few decades that are the go-to for anyone in any sector on performance management and kind of how to build a focused, balanced set of measures for telling the whole story. But more specific to our role with data, we kind of in the implementation, we always kind of move out in these concentric circles, which also comes out of performance management, is don't put the data out on transparency first, where people feel vulnerable. Yeah, those closest to the process should have the least latency and the most grain. So they're able to actually influence those measures and have the data they need to improve their process before it's seen by outside parties, kind of as it gets further away. Usually, like operational is almost real time, tactical might be monthly, like strategic might be quarterly, and transparency might be even further out after some additional validations.
I love that framework. I love a good set of concentric circles. That's really handy, Robert. Thank you. Catherine, did you want to add anything?
I think Dessa and Robert really covered a lot of the core things that I would address. I will say one thing that we've noticed within Oregon is also making sure that data and the data collections and performance management are woven into new program design. So in particular, we've encountered numerous instances where a program is started and then 6 or 8 or 12 months later, they go, we have to demonstrate that this is overall, like, we need to measure the performance of this program. How's it been going? And the program realizes, oh, we actually didn't identify that data point, or we didn't collect that, or we should have monitored that. So making sure that we build for data collection as a part of the program design and program outset is really critical. So, you know, what is this program designed to do? How do we measure that it's being successful?
Yeah, and that's a really perfect segue actually into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is when it comes to designing new programs, and specifically programs that share data across agencies, what are some of the other considerations that you have to take into account in order to make sure that that data is being shared responsibly? Because it's not just performance management, but it's also, you know, for operational purposes, how are clients or people who are receiving services being protected in the systems that are collecting data? I know many folks have maybe heard this term, but the mosaic effect is something where, you know, the more someone is represented in a bunch of discrete systems, once those systems are put together, there is now a really holistic view of this person's life and how they're showing up in public systems. So thinking about the design of those programs, how do you go about, or at least how do you start thinking about the trade-offs between the security that are needed to design the security protocols that are needed to design that program well, and the need to share that data in order for it to actually be effective? And I'll start with you this time, Robert.
So in that case, we found it helpful by having empathy for the data stewards, and we're years down this journey now, but I mean, everybody wants to share data. I think they have some understanding of the benefits and real or perceived understanding of the risk, but we really want to kind of put ourselves in their shoes and try to understand like their perception of cost, risk, and benefits, and then have some education points on that risk utility trade-off. And particularly if they've only been used to peer-to-peer, all or nothing data sharing, kind of having some talking points and some briefing points on some of the things we have now, even now, that, and pointing back to the Evidence-Based Policy Commission and some of the work done by George Duncan on, you know, trusted intermediaries, tiered access, privacy preserving techniques, these tiered security and governance controls, and the idea that it's not necessarily all or nothing, that you can make the data available to different parties for different uses while staying secure, compliant, and being respectful of everyone's privacy.
Yeah, Dessa, could you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think similar in building on this, when I'm looking at data sharing, kind of two things come to mind, and they're on different ends of the spectrum here. One is defining a common goal, right? So what are you doing? And I think that's what Robert was getting at, is like, why are we sharing these pieces of information? What is the end goal? What are we trying to do? And how I typically frame it is, what are we solving for, right? What is the end goal that we're solving for? And why do we need these 10 data points on an individual in order to tell that story, evaluate that outcome, whatever. So a quick example is the Illinois Longitudinal Data System, the ILDS. There's 8 different agencies that are included in that data share agreement. Each of those agencies had a hand in a conversation, well, many conversations, as I think everybody on this call could imagine, around what data points are we sharing, why are we doing that, but then higher level, what questions are we answering, and what data do we need in order to start answering those questions? So one is defining that common goal. And I think more on the practical side, and this gets at the privacy, security, protection of resident data, which is paramount in my mind, which is inventories and catalogs. Now, I know that this is a little bit of a hot button topic, right? Everybody's got an opinion on a data catalog. Everybody's got an opinion on an inventory. But when I think about the easiest way to get everybody on the same page of what protections apply to a system, what protections apply to a data point, what protections apply to a data set, then we can start doing that with those inventories and catalogs, because your business logic is baked into that, as well as your protections. So if something is covered under CGIS or HIPAA or PIPA or alphabet soup of protections, right? You know what that is before you start that data sharing conversation. So everybody's coming in with full knowledge of, my data is protected by X, Y, and Z. I can share bits and pieces of it. I can share the full record. I can share one piece of this record. And this is how we're going to start answering those questions. So it's kind of that big higher level thinking, and then that super granular practical, let's get everybody on the same page, protect that data before we start entering into a data share agreement.
That's great. And I really like what you said earlier, Robert, about the all or nothing data sharing mentality, because I think that all this nuance gets lost with that idea that once you share the data, it's gone and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's great. Catherine, do you want to add anything?
I think overall, starting with a shared research governance model is really critical. And I think addresses a lot of that kind of empathy for the data stewards that Robert talked about, and even the common goal identification that Dessa chatted about. So, our state longitudinal data system went through the same process that I think Illinois did. We convened agencies that had data responsive to what we wanted to accomplish with our SLDS, and spent time identifying, what does governance look like here? How does each agency have a seat at the table for how this data is used? How do they have the ability to, talk back to findings, so to speak, right? So if I get this number, but internally you produce that number, are we able to reconcile those challenges? And so we have that kind of tiered governance structure where we have research directors that sit on a governance committee, identify and prioritize research, an executive committee that then provides feedback on those research questions. So there's that ongoing continued collaboration built into the sharing of data.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah. And I want to ask a follow-up question about that. I know that this is a really tough area, but I'm wondering, just from a resident's perspective, if there's someone who's receiving services, what can they expect in terms of how to engage with their data once it's collected? Like, are any of your states working on ways for residents to be able to see what data is being collected about them, or to even opt out of that? And if not, maybe like, what are the challenges in putting in those types of processes for residents? Catherine, would you want to maybe go first?
I can find the mute button. Yes. So privacy in particular, and this is my opinion, but privacy needs to also be its own separate entity and governance structure that is a partner to data, that is a partner to information security. So in Oregon, we've been looking at and evaluating the opportunity associated with creating a chief privacy officer role that can help build some of those enterprise privacy approaches. I think if I were to offer advice to a constituent at this moment in time, I think there are organizations such as our data bodies. The city of Portland actually did some really wonderful community outreach around surveillance technology. They produced a zine and had kind of these like community outreach fellows. So there's been a lot of effort, I think, put in at the local level, in particular around educating constituents into how they appear within data systems and what opportunities they might have to engage with government to find out where they are where data specifically exists. At the state level, right now, it really comes down to, as Dessa mentioned, catalogs and inventories, right? So is there PII or PHI within this system? Obviously, FERPA and HIPAA have specific requirements around how informed consent works for research projects. So that is folded in as well, depending on the type of research. But we focus a lot on sharing with unique identifiers and not necessarily PII. But this is an area where we're looking to grow and expand as well, as can we invest in a chief privacy officer role or something that would identify a stronger enterprise privacy approach for the state.
That's great. Thank you. And Robert or Dessa, do either of you want to add to that?
And we did start with a CPO at the same time as our CDO, and like that was very, very helpful. And we usually think of tiered access as sort of the individual agency, a case manager that sees all the data, maybe a researcher who's seeing the de-identified data in a secure area, or maybe public and transparency, these kind of traditional 3 tiers. But I think really right now, lately, we've been seeing this sort of 4th tier emerge, which is like the citizen having a little bit more visibility and control over their data, but not as much like the Estonia GDPR kind of models, more coming out of interoperable learning and employment records, because I think that it's something new. It's something where it makes sense for the system to have that. So that's the first place where we're really having to think about like self-sovereign identity and the ability for consumers to be able to opt in or out of data sharing, including like revoking access.
Great, thank you. Anything to add on that, Dessa? No, we can jump to the next one.
Yeah, I think that was a great response. I really enjoyed both Catherine and Robert's response on that one.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so this is somewhat related, but I think I want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the data management stuff that goes into what makes a responsible data management program and an effective one. We at the Beeck Center, we think a lot about data equity and data bias and how to build more learning and best practices around how governments can apply values and principles to how they manage data well. And one thing that always comes up in that context is metadata, which some folks might not know about, but metadata is the data about the data. So the information about how that data is collected or stored and where the data comes from. And it's really essential for getting different users on the same page about what the data means and what it can and can't do. But I was wondering if you could each maybe share some examples of how you've taken steps to improve metadata or where the priorities are in your state around data quality improvement of that kind. And maybe I'll start with you, Dessa.
So I'm going to use the Wayback Machine for my response, looking at highlighting some of the programs that I've seen using metadata management in a really cool and innovative way that has helped data quality. So I want to highlight 2 open data portals, which I know are hot topics, and there's a lot of good information out there on there. But Cook County, for example, had a very robust data portal. Being the 2nd largest county in the country, there was a lot of information that was being requested at any given time, and FOIAs and resident requests and civic tech leaders, right? And one of the things that we did when I was there was we enforced metadata standards to every new open data set. And what this did, it did a few things. The first thing, it cut down on FOIA requests, right? The data about the data gave people the information that they needed to know before they went and did a deeper dive into asking questions. We found out often that people's questions were answered through this metadata program that we were enforcing when we would launch data sets. And it also had another side effect, which was pretty cool. It gave departments a roadmap of where they needed to improve data collection and where they needed to fill gaps to make their data higher quality, have better integrity, because they would see through this process of, oh, this doesn't quite match with what our expected values were, right? We're looking through the values and for some reason there's an extra field in here. Where did this come from? And so we were able then to work with departments and programs and say, okay, here's your point in time data, right? This is what it is right now, but how are we going to get this better for the next iteration? Because you're using this, you're sharing this with 3 other departments, you're using this in this type of analysis and this type of analysis. So it became this kind of culture of once we release an open data asset, we were able to go back and work with the departments and agencies to make them better over time. Another one is City of Chicago. So the City of Chicago has a really cool, innovative approach to open data. I don't know if you've ever poked around in there, but giving them a huge shout out. They've got a lot of data. It's really helpful. It's really useful, really local, rich data. And one of the things that I love that they do is that they use their open data portal to power their dashboards. So right there is a tie-in right there to their metadata management and their data quality directly in the data products that they're producing. And I think that having something like that exposed, obviously it is protected and is cleansed and sanitized and all of the protections are applied, but knowing where that data comes from, how often it's refreshed, who owns it, all of those different pieces for powering a public dashboard is really cool and innovative, because you know when it was last refreshed, you know when your data is stale, you know when you're getting the insights and the information that is 6 hours old or 5 minutes old. And I think that's really powerful when we think about storytelling with data, especially in, we're still in a global pandemic, but in the early phases, it was really important to know how old is this case data? Where are the vaccine clinics? All of that type of information that you can find publicly available.
Yeah, those are really powerful examples. And I really appreciate that you brought up the pandemic, because I think a lot of people realize for the first time that data needs context when you're looking for a testing location and you're like, was this updated last week or last month? So yeah, I really appreciate those examples. And maybe Robert, can I pass it off to you?
Sure, and I think I'll hit this from the complete opposite end of the spectrum. In data quality management, we always think about the river and the lake, and it's easier to, more efficient to clean the river than the lake. And so we're always thinking about the data generation process as the last best time to get that data right, because whoever's entering that data in the system was the last person who really knew what that meant. And this is where we found metadata management really beneficial in data generation. And we'll find instances where a steward doesn't understand what a field means, so they might not be putting the right value in, or even just there's not an appreciation for the importance of that data and downstream what it might be impacting. So communicating that to the data stewards and custodians is very important, or even as we're building systems, thinking about like intuitive naming of attributes. We don't like fields named category or type, type of what. So a lot of it's even just like thinking through our taxonomies of how we can be very clear and unambiguous, like within and beyond that data generation mechanism.
Yeah, I love that level of detail. The field names, it's really important. Catherine, you want to add?
I think, Oregon has really been looking at this from both ends. So we've just now launched our open data program, or at least formalized our open data program. So with that includes new metadata standards associated with publishing open data. We've also been considering metadata in the sense of how it handles or informs our approach to data equity. So looking at tools like data biographies that We All Count has created ideas around, or has some guidance around. There's also the idea of structured context, which shows up in data feminism. So the ability to include, I would say, maybe a broader range outside of those of us who are familiar with like Dublin Core or standard metadata elements, but instead also looking at, what are the elements associated with this data set that really inform our constituents' ability to reflect on the data or its associated limitations, or even interrogate some of our own bias as it's baked into that data collection process. And from an end user perspective, I think it touches back on one of our first questions, right? It's about, are we building these systems so that people understand the systems that they're using, right? Are they putting notes in this field that they shouldn't put notes in because we didn't give them another option to put the notes in a better place? Are they filling out this date field incorrectly because we haven't given them proper guidance on how that system works? So building that governance structure and that training and education structure into our end users and our system design and our system modernization also brings us back to improving data quality, right? If people know how to do the right thing and are given the avenue to do the right thing, it's far more likely that you'll see compliance with data quality at the outset.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to follow up with you about something you mentioned about data equity. I mean, for folks who don't know what that term means, it obviously is a big umbrella, but the idea is that by managing data better and by disaggregating the data by demographic characteristics, or by paying attention to who's overrepresented or underrepresented in the data, that governments and people using data for civic uses can more easily kind of understand who to serve first with data, or where the greatest needs are. And that really requires going deep into the metadata itself, or understanding how fields are broken out or how data is being collected. Can you talk a little bit more, Catherine, about how Oregon is thinking about data equity and how data quality plays a role in that?
Yeah, happily. So we're fairly young in our data equity journey. We're still exploring kind of what the opportunities are for an enterprise approach to data equity, especially because, as you mentioned, it touches on so many different elements, right? It's not just how are we analyzing data or research projects, but it's, are we interrogating the ways in which we're collecting data? Are we interrogating the ways that we frame research so that we're not always performing deficit-based research, right? That focuses on skills gaps or achievement gaps between different students or races or clients. So right now, we're mostly evaluating resources and frameworks that are out there. I know there have been a couple other states that have done comparative analyses of different data equity frameworks, but we're also reaching out to agencies to learn about where they're incorporating data equity. So a few of our agencies, our health authority and our Department of Education, are particularly focused on data equity. So we've been working with them as initial participants and kind of engagement opportunities as we build this framework, and slowly looking at, what does this mean to strategically inform all aspects of our governance and our holistic approach to data. Because I think the tendency is to say, like you would with a DEI effort, right? It's over there and it's siloed and it's a separate initiative. But really, if we're doing it well, equity is a consideration as we consider data quality, right? So are we giving folks the diversity of, race and ethnicity options, that represent their identity? Are we giving them qualitative opportunities to articulate more about who they are? Are we, I think that there was a conversation in our office once about the BRFIS, the Federal Behavioral Health Standard and Survey, and it talks a lot about kind of individual level solutions to systemic problems, right? So it's, well, have you, client A, actually visited a primary care physician in the last year, but it's not articulating, do you have access to that? Do you have transportation needs? So also making sure that as we frame questions, that we're doing so in a way that empowers our constituents, but also leads us to question, where are we experiencing gaps in service provision and delivery? So that's really our data equity approach right now, obviously, is really vast in trying to figure out that holistic plan. But I think that's a perfect example of how data quality is impacted, right? So if we're also interrogating the context in which this data is created or the standards that we have to align to, we have an opportunity there to analyze it further and identify areas of bias.
Yeah, and I want to point out as well that although race and ethnicity are often talked about in the data equity context, there are also a lot of other identifying characteristics like urban v. rural, which is a really important distinction in the conversation about broadband access. So I agree, it's a huge umbrella of an issue, and it's great to think you guys, or to know you guys are thinking about it so broadly as well. Dessa, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so this is a big meaty one, and there's a few thoughts that I have that are kind of coming through. So one is level setting on what the role of my team is in data analytics within the state of Illinois. So while data analytics is a very big umbrella, it's a spectrum. Data analytics, right? There's a spectrum along the lines, they inform each other. My team is not an analytics team. We are a data infrastructure team and an enablement team. We work with agencies and departments and programs throughout the state to get their data house in order, really that data management piece. And so, we have these enterprise applications that for data visualizations, for data management, for data warehousing, right? All of that. And then we work with agencies, departments, and programs on how are you scaling this out? How are you building maturity within your own program? Now, that level setting is important because when it comes to the outcome portion, evaluating outcomes, measurement, how are we measuring equity? How are we really pulling in these programmatic conversations into the data side? It's beyond just me. It's beyond just my team. And that is something that, there are experts who have spent their entire careers in this line of work of identifying what are the metrics that look at equitable outcomes. that is not necessarily something that's in my purview, but we work with those experts and come up with the best plan of how are we, one, sharing data, how are we collecting data, what is the data management policies, practices, and controls that we are applying to that data to make sure that everybody's on the same page. But then what different folks are doing for measurement, that's less in my wheelhouse and more in an agency analytics wheelhouse. But we also have a fantastic partner in the Governor's Office of Equity. There was a bill that was passed in 2021 that is around data governance and standardizing demographic data collection. So to your point just a minute ago, it is beyond just race, ethnicity. We are also looking at gender or sexual orientation, gender identity, date of birth, all of those different attributes that hang off of an individual that give a sense of who they are as a whole person. And some of the things that we've been going back and forth between on the data collection side and the data management side and the data usage side is, what is that taxonomy? So we know there's a federal standard. We know that there's, well, actually a few federal standards for how we aggregate data, that there are some, that the way that we understand identity is always changing, but we also know that we have technology that may be a mainframe system, for example, that is a little bit harder to change configuration from something that's cloud-based. And so it takes all of these different thought leaders coming together. It is not just one department's problem. It is not just one team's problem to solve. This is something that really takes that consideration of conversations, level setting, making sure that everybody understands what we're marching toward, what we're trying to solve for, and what's going to get us there in the shortest amount of time without burdening the communities that we're trying to help, which is a long-winded way of really saying that this is complicated. And we are doing a lot of work within the state, especially around this bill that was passed in 2021. Wow, that would not that long ago. But we're using it as kind of this larger jumping off point for how do we really ingrain equity within the data work that we're doing up front. It's not an afterthought, to Catherine's point. It is something that is already baked into data management. You need to think about where the gaps are in your data. You need to think about how questions are asked, how different communities are going to respond to those questions, and how that's going to impact the quality of the data that you collect.
That's great. Thank you. Robert?
And Catherine and Justin did a great job at answering that. I think the only other perspective I might add is just that's consistent for all states is a lot of the federal agencies are putting out their own policies. And the Department of Labor put out their enterprise data strategy, and it's based around two real policy priorities for them. And one is equity, and they're building in requirements in all of their funding for recording data in a way that can be disaggregated, so that just respond to external stimuli, we can go ahead and be collecting data in a way that we know we're required to or can anticipate being used. And we've similarly had a governor's office executive order last year to look at equity and labor force participation, and the legislature and the committee really wanted to look at intersectional identity. So these kind of external stimuli for pulling things are kind of determining the grain at which we make sure that are collected, and that we're building in the ability to disaggregate like where needed or required.
Yeah, and it is such complex work. I really admire all the work you all are doing on this front and on everything we've discussed so far. We have blazed through this time. I feel like it passed in a blink of an eye. And but we actually have a couple of really juicy questions in the chat. And so I am going to pass it to Isaac and Vince to share some of our questions from the audience. And I'll just invite everyone again to drop any additional questions in the chat so that we can share them with our panelists here. So I'll pass it off now to Vinith and Isaac.
Great. Thank you for a very insightful panel. We're going to be fielding some audience questions for the panelists now. So please drop any additional questions you have in the chat. I'll start off with one. We have a question about data quality issues. And it's, how do you evaluate the risk reward of releasing data that have quality problems? And what responsibilities do subject matter experts have here in releasing data that could be misconstrued? And I'll start with Des on that.
Yes, I have an example of this from Cook County. So again, going back to that data portal, when we enforced our metadata standards, One of the other pieces that we enforced was what I call the data explainer. And it really was a way for the data owner and the business owner to tell a story about the gaps and the holes in the methodology within their data. So oftentimes when we were releasing data on the data portal, there were two main things that we were releasing. One was a data set, right? Tabular data, rows and columns, gave you some maybe point in time information about a process or a project. Maybe it was performance metrics, right? But point in time. Other things that were released were more around analytical products. And it was releasing code and the data so that way somebody could go in and recreate what the assessor's office did, for example, which was a really brave and courageous data set that they released. But through that, we knew that there were some gaps in the data. We knew that there were some holes in the data. We knew that there were some data collection issues with it. We knew that there were some data aggregation issues with it. It wasn't that it was unknown. There were actually stories written about it in the Chicago Tribune from the assessor's office a few years prior to me coming on board. And so this was something that was known, but they really wanted to be transparent about where they were in looking at this data. So we came up with the idea to create a data explainer, which went through all of the methodologies, how fields were calculated, where there were known gaps, where they were working on data quality controls for the future. Now, was it perfect? Absolutely not. No data set is perfect. Data is chaos at its most basic level. Anybody who's worked with a data set, a raw data set, knows that it's chaos at its most basic level. But through the explanation and through driving it too, we were able to reduce the number of questions that were coming back with the release of data products. We were able to give the researchers and analysts a better roadmap of what that methodology looks like and where they needed to control and kind of overcorrect for the gaps and the holes in the data. And there was a roadmap and a benchmark for saying, this is where we are today. The next time we do a release, we expect these changes to happen. We expect this to be filled out better. We expect to have more information on this subset of the population. So it's a very fine line, right? Between transparency, giving information out to the public, to researchers, to interested parties, and then making sure that what you're giving is true and accurate and precise. And while that line is very fine, I think that when you're at the local levels in particular, it is important to be transparent and also to say, here's where the gaps are. Here's where the problems are. Here's what we are doing to impact change because of years of lack of data controls, data management, whatever that may be, but we are taking concrete efforts to make it better over time. So I don't know if that totally answers it, but something that I've thought about quite a bit.
I might just add on to that one. In analytics, we have a common saying that all models are wrong and some models are useful. And we tend to think the same thing about data. It's an imperfect representation of the real world, but it's the best we have. So, you know, in moving through those concentric circles, we don't like to get too far outside if we don't think it's a good enough representation of the real world. But ultimately, like if we need to use it to support like student career exploration and planning and things like that, knowing that there are nuances in the data, we try to kind of have a minimum threshold, kind of like remove obvious noise, and then be very, very careful in the methodology at kind of explaining some of the caveats.
Great, thank you. And Catherine, do you have anything you might want to add?
I think Dessa and Robert covered most of it, but in terms of how we handle data quality when it comes to open data, we do encourage agencies to articulate in the data dictionary any data set limitations. So, for example, when we publish IT budget information, we include the margin of error for those fields and articulate any areas where, you know, if you see a null value here, that indicates either, you know, we didn't have the data, or that the answer is, you know, so clarifying things like what does a null value mean versus zero. So I think clear articulation. I find that states and government in general tend to be more risk averse than maybe they need to be, as long as they're transparent with some of these data quality issues. I think, especially with open data and transparency, you do lose control of the narrative at a certain point, right? You release the data and you hope that your constituents use it wisely. And that's where I think adding those additional accountabilities of good metadata, good contextualization. So if someone does either misuse the data or misconstrue it, either intentionally or unintentionally, you have that that source to refer back to should there be questions that appear. But it can be really kind of challenging, and I think it's a difficult kind of cultural muscle to exercise. As we get more transparent, we get a little more comfortable with acknowledging, you know, this may not be at the quality that we want it to be, but here's how we're advising folks to navigate those quality challenges.
Great, thank you. This next question is, I think it's very interesting. It's from Melissa, and Dessa, especially given your work both at Cook County as well as not the state level. This might be an interesting one to get your perspective on. Basically, the question is, a resident could have data points at the city, county, and state level. How do you think about data sharing across jurisdictions and improving services across jurisdictions within a state? So Dessa, if you have anything interesting to share, you can kick us off.
Oh, this goes into one of the things that I say quite often. Counting is the hardest thing we do. And people laugh when I say that. You're like, you're a data person. How is counting hard? 1 + 1 = 2. Yeah, except when it doesn't. And this is one of the big challenges with sharing data across jurisdictions. Now, I have a grand vision of that between, you know, the state of Illinois, all of our 102 counties, I believe it is, and all of the municipalities that roll up into those counties, that we have robust data sharing. Now, is that possible in my tenure? It's possible. Anything's possible. Is it feasible? Probably not. But one of the things that I'm looking at to start, you know, kind of attacking this challenge is looking at methodologies for how we count. So going back to demographics, this is a really easy one. How do we count individuals and their identities when we are doing things with public facing dashboards, with open data programs? If there is a general standard that everybody can agree on, that makes the counting a lot easier, which makes the understanding of the efficacy or the cause and the effect of a program a lot easier for a general resident or a researcher to understand, because everybody is displaying information in the same way. Then when it comes to actually sharing the data, that comes into a much larger question, problem, challenge. But we saw this throughout the pandemic, right? The different health agencies had access to different pieces of information that would give you a full 360 view of the continuity of care for COVID, either vaccines, for cases, for care, all of those different pieces. You really had to get these different entities at different levels of government talking and more open to sharing data, because people's lives were literally on the line. And when I think about continuing that effort, but with a little bit more, I want to be careful here, intentionality, because we have the time and space to be more intentional. This is something that I think about a lot. And I really think that we need to start with, how do we count? How are we standardizing what we're putting out to give that concept of the throughput from the state level down to the municipal level, but then starting to look at what constitutes a person in the data sense. So what information do we have in common on a resident? What information do we have in common on processes? This kind of goes back to what Catherine started off with, is looking at process development. And how are we looking at the continuity of service and care from the state level to the municipal level, knowing that there's already data sharing going on because of the handoff from the person at the level of government, to make sure that we're really thinking about that full 360 view of not just the person, but also the process, so we have the right data moving at the right time. Now, this again is a grand vision. I am not saying that this is something that we are implementing tomorrow, but it is something that I think about a lot. But I really do think that if we start with the standardization of the view and the display of data across jurisdictions, it'll get us to a better place, so we can start talking about data sharing and making it happen in a more fluid manner.
And Robert or Catherine, is there anything you'd like to add?
I will say, you know, so I previously worked for the city of Austin and noticed kind of the transition of data that I think Dessa also pointed to, which is, you know, local municipalities produce data and they give it to the state, and then they feel like, well, God, we don't get our data back. And then I came to the state and everyone's like, we give all this data to the federal government, we don't get our data back. So I think there's that overall, like, kind of pathway of it's transparency in a way to me, right? So if a municipality has to submit data to the state should be accountable for sharing that data back out. And I think the same is true at that state federal level. The place where we've seen the greatest success with governance across multiple jurisdictions, at least public bodies, is through our geospatial data governance. And I think that's because so much geospatial data, addressing tax lots, cadastral data, administrative boundaries, a lot of that is generated at the city or county or district level. So we've been able to build some of that community of practice around shared governance. And it really requires investment from a state agency as well to say, I'm willing to step up and be the steward or the aggregator of this data set. So I think there are multiple areas where we can improve our coordination and communication, especially with local jurisdictions and public bodies at the state level.
So we're nearing the end of our time. So thank you to all of our speakers for your thoughts, and we'll pass it back to Portia for closing remarks.
Thank you. And thank you all again for joining us today, and a virtual round of applause for our incredible speakers. On behalf of the Data Labs program and the National Governors Association, we hope that you're leaving this conversation with at least one new piece of information or one new idea about using data management to improve digital delivery of public services, or at the very least, a new appreciation for going in the Wayback Machine in a data conversation. Before you go, we have a few announcements and reminders. First, as a reminder, Data Labs is currently accepting project proposals to join its next cohort. Proposals are being accepted through February 15th. To learn more about the program and submit a proposal, you can go to the Data Labs website. I think Allie's going to drop that link to the website in the chat. If you are interested in learning more about the Data Labs program, we have an information session this Friday, February 3rd at 12 p.m. Eastern. Allie will also paste a second link in the chat to RSV for that event. And if you have a question that we were not able to address in the Q&A, feel free to contact the Data Labs team after this event. Allie will also repaste the team's email in the chat, and the team will work with you offline to make sure you get an answer to your question. Lastly, before we part, we would like you all to provide a bit of feedback on today's event in the theme of data collection. We have a quick 2-question survey for you. So Allie's going to drop that link in the chat. If you could just take a moment to share your feedback, it'll really be helpful in us improving future programming. So I'm going to hold for a beat while that drops in the chat and folks take some time to complete the survey. And once you are finished, you are fine to jump off. We thank you all again for your participation today, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the day.